B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, May 31st, 2019. Our stable genius occupant of the White House has done it again. Another irrational, emotional, arbitrary move in an effort at collective punishment that is only going to hurt American consumers. Now, I realize that description could apply to many different things, so let me be more specific. Last night, the White House announced that Trump has decided, despite the fact that he has no clear authority to do this, to impose escalating tariffs on imports from Mexico. And this is an effort to force Mexico to bend to his will and stop those pesky migrants who come through Mexico in an attempt to reach the United States. So he is demanding that Mexico, which does not have the kind of power to prevent people from Guatemala or other countries from attempting to migrate north, he wants to deputize Mexico and force that nation to do the bidding of the United States. And who cares if it is humane, if it is legal? He has just decided that he wants to stop the flow of people to our southern border. And lashing out at Mexico in a manner that actually harms American consumers more just shows how irrational and obsessed this guy is. Now, it's fair to say that the flow of humans at our border has increased despite the hateful and hurtful messages, the signals that Trump has sent by separating families, by denying the asylum terms that were in effect for generations. None of it is working. And so he just escalates and imagines that at some point, all of this is going to somehow shift in his favor, in the direction that he seeks. And it shows his delusions of grandeur, his desire to be a dictator, and his deep-seated racism. Because, I've said this a billion times before, yes, we have issues with traffic at our southern border. But the vast majority of people who come to the United States without documents and stay here illegally have arrived at airports, not swimming the Rio Grande or coming to a border station on the U.S.-Mexico frontier and asking for asylum. But in his mind, which is a sick and twisted mind, it is those brown people from the South who make his skin crawl, who make his brain, whatever it is, churn. And so to impose this at this point, it is a form of collective punishment that is aimed at the wrong collective. It is a new hostage scenario. Trump first tried to take the Dreamers hostage, then the children as he separated from the parents. And he believes that this kind of fascist activity is going to change the tide. And it simply will not work. At the Washington Post, Catherine Rampell put together a list of 8 or 9 reasons why these are really stupid. Number 1, Americans will pay for the tariffs. Now, remember, this is a shocking reversal, right? It was just a couple of years ago that Trump told his mob rallies repeatedly that he's going to build a wall, and they would cheer and chime in, Mexico's going to pay for it. Congress wouldn't pay for it, and we'll get to that in a moment. But he wants Americans to pay for the complex set of issues that drive people to leave their homes and take the risk of coming to the United States. And the cost to Americans of the China trade war is already pegged at $831 per American household. And while it may be inconvenient to pay more for avocados and auto parts that are manufactured in Mexico then shipped to the U.S. for assembly here, the sheer the sheer arbitrary nature of the way Trump does this. And he said that he will relieve the sanctions. He's going to ratchet them up 5% per month until, in his opinion, things have improved sufficiently. What the hell does that mean? How does Mexico attempt to strive for some goal to see these tariffs, which are really sanctions, lifted by the capricious Trump? Rampell continues, it'll seriously screw up supply chains, hurt American companies. That's already happening. We don't know the full cost of the tariffs, but it would be painful for the United States. One estimate at a 20% rate of tariff on Mexican imports would cost Americans $286 billion in lost value to the U.S. economy and a loss of 750,000 American jobs, two-thirds of those at the expense of low to medium-skilled workers. A point I made a moment ago, it's not clear that these tariffs are legal. The White House cites the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, but it's never been used for tariffs. Trump doesn't care. So sue me. He's got, 49 lawsuits going at any moment, and he doesn't care. Rampell continues, Mexico doesn't have the power to do the thing Trump seems to be asking Mexico to do. There is no plan, Mick Mulvaney acknowledged. When asked what it would take to remove the tariffs, he said the decision would be ad hoc. That means Trump will pull it out of his big fat ass. This new self-inflicted trade war wound gives us less leverage in negotiating a new trade deal with China, European Union, Japan. Yeah, we are not a reliable partner to sit down at the bargaining table and say, hey, this is how you're damaging us and we want to offset it in this manner. It is not rational. And I will repeat for any new listeners that I'm not a free trader. I support rational, reasonable protectionism for American jobs and industries. But it has to be reasonable, it has to be rational, and otherwise, it is simply an emotional outburst, and we are the victims. So it does impact the farm states that Trump relies on for a lot of his political support. In an editorial, the New York Times hammers Trump. He persists in the falsehood that tariffs are paid by America's trading partners. The truth is that Mexico would no more pay these tariffs than it is paying for the construction of a border wall. The evidence is clear. Trump's tariffs are taxes being paid by Americans. And we have this whiplash problem. Just earlier this month in May, Trump ended a tariff on Mexican aluminum and steel, and Mexico ended a tariff on American farm goods. Now, the new leader of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, he said that he wants to avoid getting into a confrontation with Trump. He doesn't want to poke the bear. He said he's dispatching a delegation to Washington led by his foreign minister to try to talk Trump out of carrying out this threat. AMLO said his envoys would present evidence to American officials that they've already been trying to slow the tide of immigration. And he said, I want to insist that we are not going to fall to any provocation. We are going to act with prudence, with respect for the authorities of the United States. So he's trying not to get into a straight-up pissing match with Trump. And he said he anticipated that in time Trump will abandon his threat because these measures don't suit the Mexicans nor the Americans. And so far, this approach seems to have worked and avoided kind of a full-blown exchange. AMLO has adopted a measured posture, urging dialogue, counting on mutual economic interests to prevail, and so far his bet has paid off, says a New York Times report, and Trump has stepped back from his threats. So the judge across the bay from me in Oakland, who ruled against Trump a week ago, in a ruling where he said you cannot divert money from the Pentagon to pay for a border wall that Congress refused to fund. That is the decision of District Judge Haywood Gilliam. And almost immediately, at lightning speed, the U.S. government appealed his decision and asked him to allow construction to proceed while the court processes go forward. And the judge instantly responded. He said the injunction that he issued less than a week ago rejected all of the arguments that the administration officials now advance regarding their intended use of funds. Allowing construction while the government appeals his ruling would effectively moot the case. So he is not going to get out of the way. Now, in a sop to the farmers who've seen their soybean and other exports to China sharply drop and hammer their financials as the weather has hammered the crops, the floods continue in many areas. Well, Trump, again, in an effort that appears to violate the law, has said that they have lifted the summertime ban on the use of E15, a gasoline blend made of 15% ethanol. This is designed to help corn and soybean farmers who've been harmed by the tariffs and the war with China. Now, as you know, this goes back, both parties have propped up the ethanol market. It's not a successful product. And the law explicitly says that it should not be used in the summertime because of the excess smog that is produced. And get this, the American Petroleum Institute is against it. Can you figure? Extending this waiver is an anti-consumer policy that risks causing costly engine and fuel system damage to nearly 3 out of 4 vehicles on the road today. This premature policy attempts to push E15 into the market before it's ready. But a more credible opponent is the president of the National Wildlife Federation, Colin O'Mara. Allowing the year-round sale of E15 gasoline is both illegal under the Clean Air Act and will accelerate the destruction of wildlife habitat and pollution of our air and drinking water. Doesn't bother Trump? Nah. He's in pander mode. And his unholy alliance with the God Squad in this country, the evangelical extremists, the American Taliban, if you will, is leading to a dark day in Missouri. And legal wrangling will continue into the night against a midnight deadline of the expiration of Planned Parenthood's state permit to operate the only abortion clinic in the state of Missouri. And this is intentional. This Governor Mike Parson, he mouths these issues that, Planned Parenthood's out of compliance and they won't sit down and let us interrogate their employees. The Planned Parenthood people have made it very clear that Missouri has kept shoveling new restrictions on abortion rights, the license terms, how wide the hallways are, a lot of trivial and irrelevant issues that are just obstacles, and they are pretexts to create ways to block abortions in all cases. And this is just a really dark day in America, as we are seeing a minority of Christian activists impose their views and values on the rest of us. The Republican Party sees this to its benefit. And the debate over abortion rights has been reduced to, hey, no problem with a fetal heartbeat bill, but does it have an exception for incest, rape, or the health of the mother? That's the narrow range of debate today. There should be outrage at all of these laws. And they are clearly aiming for the Supreme Court, which this week once again ducked the central issue of a right to choose and upheld Mike Pence's ridiculous Indiana law that requires abortion providers to bury or cremate the fetal remains. Interesting opinion piece published in the New York Times today, and curiously, when I went to get the link to include it in the show file, this editorial is gone. It was written by Rob Schenck, president of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute in Washington. He is an evangelical minister who spent most of his life trying to end abortion rights in this country, and he has made a reversal. He says, many of my former allies will call me a turncoat. I still believe that every abortion is a tragedy, and that when a woman is pregnant, bringing the child into the world is always ideal. Reality, though, is different from fantasy. I wish every child could be fully nurtured and cared for, and could experience all the wonderful possibilities that life can offer. But that's not how things turn out for every mother and child. As I've preached countless times, loving our neighbors means meeting them where they are, not where we want them to be. I can no longer pretend that telling poor pregnant women that they have just one option, give birth and try your luck raising a child, even though the odds are stacked against you, is pro-life in any meaningful sense. And when this message is delivered to poor women by overwhelmingly middle or upper-class white men, it adds insult to injury. To my former allies who are cheering on the challenges to Roe, I say, put your money where your mouth is. Devote yourself and your considerable resources to taking care of poor women and their children before you champion laws that hem them into impossible situations. A pro-lifer who has come to the conclusion that being pro-birth is often highly hypocritical. Meanwhile, the fate of Julian Assange, his health, and his psychological condition are in the news again, as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, has gone public. In 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. He visited Assange on May 9th, along with 2 medical experts. He said Assange showed symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. He has been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to progressive, severe forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the cumulative effects of which can only be described as psychological torture. And according to Melzer, Assange is not in solitary confinement conditions and is not in the high-security zone of the Belmarsh prison. He went on to say it is extremely worrying that Ecuador has proceeded with the search and seizure of property, documents, information, and other material belonging to the defense of Julian Assange, which Ecuador arbitrarily confiscated so that these can be handed over to the agent of political persecution against him. And that is a statement, by the way, I may have inferred that was coming from Melzer. It's actually attributed to Baltazar Garzón, the international legal coordinator for Assange and WikiLeaks. And in addition, The Guardian, which has a really checkered history related to Assange and WikiLeaks, is producing a reliable report today on the Melzer comments. Physically, there were ailments, but that side of things are being addressed by the Prison Health Service, nothing urgent or dangerous. What was worrying was the psychological side, his constant anxiety. It was perceptible that he had a sense of being under threat from everyone. He understood what my function was, but it's more that he was extremely agitated and busy with his own thoughts. It was difficult to have a very structured conversation with him. And I have no indication that Assange has been tortured or drugged while in the custody of the British. But it wouldn't surprise me. Back in January, Derek Seidman joined us for a podcast about outgoing Governor Jerry Brown and his ties to the oil industry. And Seidman writes for littlesis.org, and they uncover corruption in high places. And in a new report this week that I've linked to in the show file for this podcast, we hear about the Baker-Schultz plan. Baker-Schultz plan, proposing a carbon tax of $40 per ton. It's named after James A. Baker and George Shultz, the former Reagan Secretaries of State. It's being promoted by the Climate Leadership Council and its lobbying arm, Americans for Carbon Dividends. It is funded by BP, Exxon, ConocoPhillips, and Shell. Yes, they want to tax themselves with a carbon tax that would be returned to taxpayers rather than used by the government to oversee an accelerated transition to a system of renewable energy. So this cynical effort includes some of the biggest brains in Washington, like former Senators Trent Lott and John Breaux, who was the senator from Oil and Gas, a nominal Democrat. And joining them are people like Joe Crowley, the powerhouse Democratic congressman who was defeated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He's now over there lobbying at Squire Patton Boggs. And they are planning to roll out a campaign which would be greenwashing at its lowest to persuade Americans to back their corporate-friendly carbon tax as a way of crippling any effort to fund a Green New Deal or similar programs. As you know, I do not consider Robert Mueller to be a saint. I also don't think that Attorney General Bill Barr is an honorable guy. But Barr is who we've got. And in an interesting piece, I've linked to it, it's an analytical piece by Philip Bump in the Washington Post today. He basically engages in an argument with Barr regarding Barr's plan to investigate the investigation that led to the Russiagate scandal. And as you know, I believe that such an investigation is called for. I don't have confidence that Bill Barr will give us an honest investigation. But the Washington Post is using this analysis to clamp down on attacks on the Russiagate narrative. And if Barr investigates Fusion GPS, Stephen Halper, who ran the British operation, the connections to Christopher Steele and Richard Dearlove, former head of the British intelligence unit MI6, well, those are, I think, solid leads that deserve investigation. And Bump pushes back on Barr's reference to the text messages of former FBI top investigator Peter Strzok. And I'd like to see an honest investigation of Strzok. He was the one in charge of the Hillary Clinton email investigation, and then they put him in charge of the early stages of the Trump-Russia investigation. And so this will proceed. We'll keep watching it, and we'll call out when I see any political bias or spin that is applied to the investigation. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Great people like Carla Mahoney, she's been with me for a long time. Patrick Gouret, Ben Brotman, Polina Vasilev. I appreciate the $5 that each of you kick in on a monthly basis. It validates my work, it covers my costs, and someday I might get paid for this. If you'd like to subscribe, I'd like you to. Visit peterbcollins.com, click menu, then click Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and you can choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. And as always, if you're allergic to PayPal, yo comprendo, you can communicate with me by the U.S. mail at Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, zip code 94915. Want to recommend a piece published today at Consortium News, originally posted at Tom Englehart's site, Tom Dispatch, under the byline of Danny Serson. There is a silent J behind the S in Serson. He's a retired U.S. Army major, former history instructor at West Point, 2 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he attacks John Bolton for his silly copycat use of a meme from a George W. Bush speech back in 2002 when he called Iran, Iraq, and North Korea the axis of evil. It was David Frum who wrote that bullshit. Well, Bolton referred to Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua as a troika of tyranny. And I think Serson has a powerful voice as a veteran who criticizes the U.S. for trying to start new wars, and he compares the demonization of Latin American socialists with the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israel. And that part about Israel raises eyebrows, and I'm glad to see a man in his position make those eyebrows arch. So I encourage you to read the piece. I put out a request to Major Serson for an interview, and if he responds, I'll bring that to you in the very near future. Speaking of Venezuela, I didn't know about this, but there was a round of talks between the Maduro government's representatives and those of Juan Guaido, the would-be president of Venezuela. They occurred in Norway, and they are over. Nothing really came out of it, but it did mark a change in strategy by the Guaido opposition. Now they are kind of returning to the original approach, issuing a statement calling for Maduro's ouster along with a transitional government and free elections. And last week at The Nation, Jeff Faux, F-A-U-X, who is the, he's over at the Economic Policy Institute. He's the founder of it. And I don't know him and haven't seen his byline before. He wrote a piece that I have some quibbles with, but the central thrust is accurate. Why are leading Democrats supporting Trump on Venezuela? And while he is too generous in allowing, that socialism is bad and that Maduro has been more of an authoritarian, he does note that the embrace of sanctions by people like Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Schumer and Amy Klobuchar and Kirsten Gillibrand and Senator Dick Durbin, they assure us, of course, that they are not promoting war. Rather, they support the presumably more moral policy of harsh sanctions. And he notes correctly that 40,000 Venezuelans have died as a result of U.S. sanctions in the last 2 years alone. And where I disagree with him, he says Trump, who still has a cloud over his own election, claims that Maduro rigged the voting in 2018. And Faux says there's little doubt that he did, and I quibble with that. What he says here next is true. The major cause of the low turnout at 46%, down from 80% in the prior presidential election, was the Trump-supported boycott of the election by some of the opposition parties. That is 100% true. So read the piece and decide for yourself. In Syria, meanwhile, we have moved on, but the brutal war there continues as Assad's air force has been bombing Idlib province, trying to rout the final elements of the Islamic State and the other fighting groups that have been there for years now. More than 250,000 people have been displaced just in the past month. People are camping out in open fields and then running when they hear aircraft in the distance. And one expert predicts as many as 600,000 may be displaced in the next week or two. Trump often idolizes Kim Jong-un because Kim can do whatever he wants. And Kim has sidelined his top negotiator, Kim Yong-chol, who's a former North Korean spy master, vice chairman of the Workers' Party, a high-ranking guy. Now, one South Korean newspaper reported that Kim had been banished to forced labor. Others have suggested he may have already been executed, and that other members of the negotiating team may have met a similar fate. There's a lot of speculation there, I can tell, but the bottom line is that Kim Jong-un has the absolute power to order people to a work camp or to just be purged from their position. He has no opposition, and that's what Trump really, really is jealous of. Finally, we have 14 of the Democratic presidential candidates swarming to the Bay Area for this 3-day weekend. The California Democratic Party is holding its convention here in the Bay Area, and most of these candidates will be given a 20-minute opportunity to address the delegates. Bernie Sanders and I think Elizabeth Warren are holding rallies that don't require you to be a member of the state party or be a delegate, and beyond that, they'll be trying to raise a lot of money and generate some headlines. And there's a lot of grumbling about the recently announced rules. They were just popped on Wednesday morning by Tom Perez, the head of the Democratic National Committee, which doubles the requirement of the number of donors if you want to participate in the debates starting in September. Now, this is an effort to thin the herd, but it is forcing the campaigns to, instead of trying to build broad support over a long term, to scramble for short-term financial support and to get somebody to kick in $1 to a campaign can cost between $25 and $75 in advertising expenses, mostly on Facebook. So this is producing some perverse outcomes. People are not yet focusing on the complicated formula of who gets to participate in the debates, which debate. Will Sanders and Biden be on the same stage at the same time? We've got questions, and we'll keep seeking answers. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it with absolutely anyone, including Joe Biden. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.